The Flint Hills of Kansas stretched out in every direction like a green and golden sea, endless and indifferent, broken only by the occasional dark line of a creek bed and the pale scratch of a wagon road cutting west. It was a land that did not apologize for itself. It asked no permission and offered no comfort to those who could not earn it. And it was into this land, on a dry Thursday morning in the late summer of 1883, that Mae Whitfield arrived at the Alderman farm with nothing but a battered trunk, a steady gaze, and a mind that moved faster than most men cared to admit. The wagon that brought her belonged to a feed merchant from Beaumont who had agreed to carry her as far as the Alderman gate in exchange for the last of her coin. He pulled the mules to a stop, waited just long enough for her to climb down, and turned the rig around without a word. Mae did not watch him go. She was already looking at the farm. It was not what she had imagined, though she was honest enough with herself to admit she had not imagined much. She had been too busy surviving to afford imagination. The house was solid, built of limestone blocks quarried from the hills themselves, gray and permanent looking, the kind of structure that said its builder had intended to stay. A wide porch ran the length of the front, its boards worn smooth and pale from years of boots and weather. Behind the house, a barn of good timber stood with its doors thrown open to catch the morning air, and beyond that, a cluster of outbuildings, a smokehouse, a root cellar, a chicken coop, spread out like a small and serious town. The fields to the east were harvested, the wheat stubble bright gold in the early light. The fields to the west were not. That was the first thing she noticed. Half the farm was done, and half was standing still. A man appeared in the barn doorway, shading his eyes against the sun. He crossed the yard toward her, with the kind of walk that belonged to men who spent their days outdoors, not hurried, not lazy, just deliberate, like every step was a decision made and kept. He was perhaps 35, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair shot through with the first threads of gray at the temples. His face was weathered in the way of honest work rather than hard living, and his eyes, when they finally reached her, were a dark, careful brown. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the trunk. "Miss Whitfield," he said. "Mr. Alderman." She held his gaze without wavering. "I understand the position is still available." "It is." He studied her, the way a man studies a piece of ground, before he decides whether to plant it. "You're younger than I expected." "I'm 22, Mae said, "and I can keep accounts, manage a household, teach a child to read, and put up a season's worth of preserves before the first frost. My age is the least relevant fact about me." Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't quite a smile. It was closer to the look a man gets when something turns out to be sturdier than he counted on. He nodded once, slow and certain. "The position is room and board, and a wage of $8 a month," he said. "You'll manage the house, see to my daughter, and keep the farm accounts. I've let them go longer than I should have." "That last part I suspected," Mae said, without unkindness. He blinked. Then he picked up her trunk, the way a man does when he's decided something, and carried it toward the house. His daughter's name was Cora. She was 9 years old, with a tangle of dark curls and her father's watchful eyes, and she stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed and her chin raised in the particular way of children who have learned to be cautious about hoping. She looked Mae over with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and suspicion. "Are you going to stay?" Cora asked. "I intend to," Mae said. "The last one didn't. I'm not the last one." Cora considered this with great seriousness. Then she uncrossed her arms and stepped back from the doorway to let Mae inside. It was, Mae would understand later, the most important threshold she crossed that day. The kitchen was clean but joyless, the way a space gets when it is maintained by obligation rather than care. The curtains at the window were gray with age. The shelves were organized but bare of anything that was not strictly necessary. Mae stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, taking it in the way she took everything in, cataloging, calculating, understanding the shape of the problem before she reached for any solution. She cooked supper that evening from the supplies in the larder: salt pork, sweet potatoes roasted in the coals, Cornbread made with the last of the good buttermilk she found in the cooling cellar. Simple food, but she seasoned it properly, and she cooked it with attention, which is a thing that comes through in the eating, even when you can't name it. Caleb Alderman sat at the head of his table. Cora sat at his right hand. And for the first time since Mae had arrived, there was a third place set at the left. Mae noticed it when she came to serve. She stood for a moment, looking at the empty chair, at the plate and the fork and the tin cup that had been placed there without ceremony or comment. She looked at Caleb. He was already focused on Cora, cutting the girl's meat with the patient precision of a father who had been doing it alone for a long time. He did not explain the third setting. He did not look up. He simply passed the bread when it was within his reach, and moved the serving dish to the center of the table where anyone sitting there could reach it. Mae sat down. It was such a small thing. A plate, a chair, a place at the table. But Mae had spent the last year in a Kansas City boarding house where she ate standing over a cold stove at 10 o'clock at night, after the guests were done and the cook was half asleep. She had spent months being invisible in rooms full of people who needed her labor and not her presence. To sit, to be given a chair and a full plate and a candle that lit her face the same as everyone else's, she felt the tightness in her chest that she recognized as the specific ache of being treated like a person when you had stopped, expecting it. She didn't say anything, neither did he. Cora talked enough for all three of them. That night, after the dishes were washed and Cora was asleep in her small room off the back hallway, Mae lit a lamp and carried it to the small desk in the parlor where Caleb kept his farm records. She had asked about them at supper, and he had gestured vaguely in that direction, the gesture of a man who has been avoiding something for so long that avoidance has become a kind of habit. What she found was not a disaster. It was worse than a disaster. It was a disaster that had been papered over with optimism and hope and the particular blindness of a man who understood land and weather and seed, but who had never been taught that numbers, like fields, go to ruin when left untended. There were 2 ledger books, neither of them current by more than 8 months. There were receipts stuffed between the pages, some of them paid and some of them not, with no system to tell them apart. There was a letter from the Beaumont Bank and Loan, written in the careful, regretful language that banks use when they are not yet prepared to be angry, but want you to understand that anger is coming. The annual note on the farm, a debt of $380, was due in 42 days. Mae spread everything out across the desk and began. She worked the way she always worked, methodically, without hurry, without panic. Numbers did not frighten her. They never had. Her father had been a merchant in Ohio before the war took him, and he had taught her his accounts the way other fathers taught their sons, sitting beside her at a desk very much like this one, showing her that figures told the truth when people wouldn't. She understood ledgers the way some people understood music. She heard the pattern in them. She heard when something was wrong, and something was very wrong here. By 2 in the morning, she had reconstructed 14 months of accounts from the scattered records on the desk. The farm's income was steady, modest but sufficient. The wheat yields were solid. The cattle sales were regular. On paper, there was no reason for the shortfall at the bank. But the shortfall was real, and when she traced the money carefully, she found where it was going. There was a man named Dillard Pruitt who operated as a grain broker out of Beaumont. For the last 3 seasons, every bushel of alderman wheat had gone through Pruitt's operation. The rate Pruitt paid per bushel was recorded in Caleb's accounts as the market price. Mae had grown up in a merchant's home. She knew the market price for Kansas wheat in the harvest seasons of 1,880, 1,881, and 1,882, and the rate Pruitt had paid was not it. It was close enough to seem plausible to a man who trusted the broker, but it was low. Consistently, carefully, precisely low. Not so low that any single sale looked like theft, but across 3 years and hundreds of bushels, the difference added up to more than $200. Mae set her pen down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. She thought about her father, who had been cheated by a business partner once, before she was old enough to understand what it meant, only old enough to understand what it cost. She thought about the letter from the bank, polite, and patient and waiting. She thought about Cora, asleep down the hall, with her careful eyes and her crossed arms and her question, "Are you going to stay?" Mae picked up her pen. She drafted 2 letters before dawn. The first was addressed to the grain exchange office in Topeka, requesting the published average price per bushel for winter wheat in Kansas for the past 3 harvest seasons. The second was addressed to a neighbor whose name appeared several times in Caleb's records as a buyer of seed stock, a man named Haskell, regarding an unpaid balance of $31 that appeared in the SAT's accounts with no record of settlement. She sealed both envelopes and left them on the kitchen table. When Caleb came in from the early chores, he found Mae at the stove, with a fire going and coffee on, and the letters on the table beside his cup. He stood in the doorway, reading the name on the first envelope. Then he looked at her with an expression that she was beginning to recognize. Not quite surprise, but a recalibration, a quiet internal adjustment. "There are some questions in the accounts," Mae said, her tone level. "I'll need a few days to sort them properly." "How bad?" he asked. She looked at him. He was a man, she had already decided, who would rather have the truth than the comfort. "I'll know more in a few days," she said, "but I'll need those letters sent." He picked them up without comment and put them in his shirt pocket. Then he poured his coffee and sat at the table, and after a moment said, "Cora likes you." Mae stirred the pot on the stove. "How can you tell?" "She set your place at the table this morning," he said. "Before I was up." Mae did not turn around. She did not want him to see her face just then. The days settled into a rhythm, the way days do on a working farm when the work is genuine and the people doing it are serious about it. Mae ran the house with a quiet efficiency that left room, always, for Cora. The girl was bright and hungry for learning in the way of children who have spent too much time with only adults for company. Mae taught her arithmetic at the kitchen table in the evenings, and Cora took to it with a ferocity that reminded Mae uncomfortably of herself at that age. She taught her to read from a copy of Pilgrim's Progress she found on the parlor shelf, and Cora read it straight through in 6 days and wanted to discuss it. "Christian has to leave his family," Cora said one evening, her brow furrowed over the book. "That doesn't seem fair." "A lot of things that are necessary aren't fair," Mae said, "but he goes anyway, because staying would be worse." Cora thought about this for a long time. Then she looked up. "Is that why you came here? Because staying somewhere else would have been worse?" Mae looked at the girl, 9 years old, with the eyes of someone twice that. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly why." Cora nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. Then she went back to her book. The reply from Topeka arrived first, on a Tuesday, in a thin envelope with the grain exchange seal. Mae read it at the desk in the parlor, while Cora was out in the yard with the barn cats. The numbers were what she expected. The average published price for Kansas winter wheat in those 3 seasons was precisely as she had remembered it. Pruitt had paid Caleb between 6 and 9 cents per bushel below market on every sale. The total difference across 3 seasons was $214. $214 that should have been in Caleb Alderman's accounts, sitting instead in Dillard Pruitt's. The reply from Haskell came 3 days later, with $31 in cash folded inside a brief apologetic note. Mae recorded the payment in the ledger, placed the cash in the strongbox she had organized on the parlor shelf, and wrote Haskell a receipt. Caleb was in the North Field when the second letter arrived. Mae carried both documents to him at noon when she brought the midday meal. He read them in the bed of the wagon while she waited. She watched his face as he read. She saw the moment the Pruitt numbers landed. His jaw tightened. His hand stilled on the page. He read it again, more slowly. 3 years, he said. "Yes." "And the total, $214. She paused. "Which means that without that theft, you would have had sufficient funds to carry the mortgage payment without difficulty. The shortfall at the bank is not a consequence of poor farming, Mr. Alderman. It's a consequence of being systematically cheated by your broker." He looked out across the North Field for a long moment. The wheat stubble stood pale and even in the noon light. He had harvested that wheat with his own hands. He had worked that soil since before Cora was born. "What do we do?" he said. It was not quite a question. "We have $31 from Haskell," Mae said. "I believe there are two other small outstanding accounts we can recover enough to bring us within $70 or $80 of the full payment. I've also identified 3 weeks of unnecessary expenses in the farm ledger that we can eliminate immediately." She folded her hands in front of her apron. "As for Pruitt, we document everything, clearly, in a form that would stand in a county court. We don't accuse him publicly yet. We wait." Caleb looked at her. "Wait for what?" "For him to come to us," Mae said. "He will. Harvest season is coming, and he'll want the alderman wheat for his next round of sales. When he does, we'll be ready." Caleb studied her face for a moment, with the same careful attention he gave to the sky when he was reading weather. Then he picked up his coffee and drank. "All right," he said. "Pruitt came on a Wednesday, 3 weeks before the mortgage was due. The morning was cool and bright. One of those early autumn days in Kansas when the sky is such a hard, clean blue that it almost hurts to look at it. Mae was at the clothesline in the side yard when she saw the buggy coming up the road. Black buggy, good horse, a man sitting in it with the easy posture of someone who had never had much reason for humility. She had never met Dillard Pruitt, but she recognized him from the way he held the reins. She finished pinning the last of the shirts to the line. She smoothed her apron with both hands. Then she walked to the front of the house and stood at the top of the porch steps. Pruitt climbed out of the buggy and looked at her with the expression of a man who has arrived, expecting to speak to the person in charge, and found someone he considers a pleasant obstacle. He was about 50, heavy-set, with a prosperous face and small, quick eyes. "Morning," he said, pleasantly enough. "I'm looking for Caleb Alderman. Grain business." "Mr. Alderman is in the south field," Mae said. "He's asked me to handle the farm accounts. I'm Miss Whitfield." Pruitt's pleasant look did not quite leave his face, but it shallowed. "His housekeeper?" "His bookkeeper," Mae said. "And his housekeeper. Is there a difference that matters to your business?" A small pause. "I suppose not," Pruitt said, recalibrating. "I wanted to talk to him about this year's wheat, get a contract signed before the rush. I can offer him a good price." "How good?" Mae asked. He named a figure. It was, as she had anticipated, below market. Mae looked at him with the same calm, unhurried steadiness she brought to everything. "That's an interesting number," she said. "Given that the published exchange price this season is running 9 cents higher per bushel." The pleasant look went away entirely. Mae stepped back into the house and returned a moment later, carrying a thin folder of papers. She did not open it. She held it at her side, loose and easy, the way a person holds something they are completely comfortable with. "I've been reviewing the Alderman farm accounts," she said, her voice as level and warm as a schoolteacher's. "All of them, back 3 seasons." She let that land. "There appear to be some discrepancies between the rates recorded in your receipts and the published market averages for those periods. The figures are quite detailed. I've documented them carefully, in a form that I'm told is very legible to the county clerk's office." Pruitt's face had gone through several colors. It had arrived, for the moment, at a controlled and careful stillness. "Now," Mae continued, in exactly the same tone, "you're welcome to review the documentation yourself, and we can discuss how to resolve the clerical irregularities of the past 3 years before you and Mr. Alderman discuss any new contracts. Or you can conduct your business elsewhere this season, and we can settle the historical account through the appropriate county office." She tilted her head slightly. "Whatever is most convenient for you." The silence on the porch stretched out long and thin. A meadowlark called somewhere out in the stubble fields. The sound of it was so ordinary, so indifferent to the thing happening on the porch steps, that Mae found it almost funny. Pruitt's jaw worked for a moment without producing speech. He looked at the folder in her hand. He looked at her face. He found no trace of uncertainty in either place. "I'll be in touch," he said, his voice stripped of its warmth. "Of course," Mae said pleasantly. "I'll be here." He got back into his buggy and turned it around and drove away faster than he had arrived. Mae watched until the road was empty. Then she let out a slow, careful breath. Her hands, she noticed, were perfectly steady. She had not expected them to be. She was 22 years old, and she had just stood down a man who had been stealing for 3 years from a family she had known for less than 2 months. She was steady, and she was grateful for it. She went back to the clothesline to finish her work. Caleb came in at dusk, as he always did. He washed his hands and face on the porch. He sat at the table. Cora had set his place and Mae's in her own, and the three of them sat down to supper as they had every evening for nearly a month now, a habit that had formed so naturally that Mae could not have said when it had started feeling like something other than an arrangement. She told him about Pruitt's visit over supper, quietly, between bites, the way she might report on the weather or the state of the root cellar. Caleb listened without interrupting. Cora listened too, her eyes moving between the two adults with the focused attention of a child who understands that something important is being said, even if she can't follow all of it. When Mae finished, Caleb was quiet for a moment. He looked at his plate. Then he said, "You stood on my porch alone and faced him down with a folder of papers." "I had the numbers," Mae said. The numbers were enough. He looked at her then, and the look was not the careful, assessing look of the first day, or the quiet, respectful look of the past weeks. It was something else, something that had not been there before and did not know yet what to call itself. Mae looked back at him, and then she looked down at her plate, because she was 22 and she was honest enough to admit that some things were still capable of surprising her. A wire arrived from Topeka the following week. Dillard Pruitt, it emerged, had been the subject of a complaint filed with the county grain inspector by a second farmer, a man from the next township who had been shown a copy of Mae's documentation shared, by Mae's suggestion, through a mutual acquaintance and had recognized his own experience in it. The county inspector was opening a formal review. Pruitt's brokerage license would be suspended pending investigation. On the same day that wire arrived, the last of the outstanding farm accounts was settled. A payment of $47 from a cattle sale that Mae had found recorded but never formally closed in the ledger. She entered it in the accounts in her careful, steady hand, and the column of figures resolved into something clean and sufficient. They had the money, all $380, with $9 remaining, she told Caleb at supper. He put down his fork and sat very still for a moment, the way a man does when something he has been braced against simply ceases to press. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He looked at Mae. "You did that," he said. "The accounts did that," Mae said. "I just read them correctly." "Mae." His voice was different. She had noticed, over the weeks, that he used her given name only when something mattered. "You came here to keep a house and mind the books. That was the arrangement." "It was," she agreed. "You did a good deal more than that. The situation called for it." He was quiet again. Cora, who had been following this exchange with great interest, looked between them and wisely said nothing, which was unusual enough that Mae noticed it. "I'd like to ride into Beaumont tomorrow," Mae said, "to deliver the payment to the bank in person." She paused. "I think it would be better coming from both of us." He looked at her, a long, careful look. "Yes," he said. "I think it would." They rode into Beaumont the following morning, Caleb on his good horse, and Mae in the farm wagon with Cora beside her on the seat. The town was busy with the tail end of the harvest season, the main street full of wagons and men in work clothes. When Caleb and Mae walked into the bank together and laid $380 on the cashier's counter and asked for a receipt, the cashier, a young man who knew the Alderman account well and had been nervous about its prospects, looked from one of them to the other with visible relief. "The account is settled in full," he said. "Congratulations, Mr. Alderman." "Miss Whitfield," Caleb said, without looking at the cashier, "is the one you ought to be congratulating." They stopped at the general store on the way back to the wagon. The woman behind the counter, a Mrs. Faraday, who knew everyone's business in the way of small-town storekeepers, leaned across the counter and said, in a lowered voice that was not low at all, "I hear Dillard Pruitt's going to have a hard winter. What with the county review." She looked at Mae with frank appreciation. "I hear that's got something to do with you, Miss Whitfield." Mae set her list on the counter. "I just balanced some accounts," she said. "Mrs. Faraday laughed the way women laugh when they recognize a gift for understatement. She gave Mae a very good price on the calico. The evening they returned from Beaumont was the first cool evening of the year, the first night that carried the real edge of autumn rather than just the suggestion of it. Caleb lit the fire after supper, and the three of them sat together in the parlor for a while, Cora with her book, Caleb with the next season's planting records, Mae with her mending. The ordinary domestic quiet of it was so complete that Mae felt, for a moment, almost afraid of it. She was not accustomed to things that felt this solid. Later, after Cora was in bed, she was alone in the kitchen washing the last few cups when Caleb came and stood in the doorway. She had known he was going to say something. She had felt it all evening, the way you feel a change in the weather before it arrives. "I've been thinking," he said. "I know," Mae said. A pause. "What do you know, exactly?" She set the cup down and turned to face him. He was standing in the doorway with his arms at his sides, in the way of a man who has decided to say something honest and is making sure there is nothing in his hands to fidget with. "I know that you're going to say something about the arrangement," she said. "I am." He crossed the kitchen and leaned against the far counter, several feet away from her, because he was a man who respected distance and the weight of proper things. "The arrangement was that you'd work here through the winter. Room and board, $8 a month. I remember. I'm asking you to change it." He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking you to stay, not as my bookkeeper, not as my housekeeper." He looked at the floor briefly, then back up. "Cora needs a mother. This farm needs a partner, and He stopped, began again. "I need someone who can sit across from me at supper and tell me the truth. I haven't had that in a long time." His voice was even, but his eyes were not entirely. "I would like you to consider becoming my wife, Miss Whitfield, if you're of a mind to." Mae was quiet for a moment. She looked at him standing there in the lamplight of his kitchen, in the house that was becoming hers, with the accounts she had saved locked in the strongbox on the parlor shelf and Cora asleep down the hall. "I've been of a mind to for some time," she said. "I was waiting for you to get there." Something came into his face, not quite a smile, but everything a smile is made of. "I'm a slow man," he said. "You're a steady one," Mae said. "I'll take that." They were married in the Beaumont church in October, on a morning when the cottonwoods along the creek had gone entirely gold. The whole town came, or enough of it that the pews were full and several people stood in the back. Mrs. Faraday pressed a wrapped parcel of good linen into Mae's hands before the service. Haskell, the neighbor who had paid his debt, sat in the third row and cried in an unself-conscious way that made Mae like him very much. Cora stood beside Mae at the front of the church in a new dress of blue wool, her dark curls pinned back for the occasion, her expression one of solemn, proprietary joy, the look of a child who had bet on someone and won. The years that followed were built the way good things are built steadily, from sound materials, with attention paid to what lasts. The farm grew. The north fields were plowed and planted. A second milk cow was added, and then a small flock of sheep that had been Mae's idea, the wool giving them a second income stream that carried them through a dry summer when the wheat prices fell. The grain went to auction in Topeka now, through a reputable house that Mae had researched thoroughly before the first contract was signed. The accounts were in order. They were always in order. Caleb learned to read them, sitting beside her at the desk in the parlor on winter evenings, the lamp between them, Cora doing her lessons at the other end of the table. He asked good questions. He was not a quick study, but he was thorough, and he remembered what he learned. By the third year, he could read a season's accounts himself and know what they meant. Mae taught him, with the same patience her father had shown her, the deep patience of a person who believes the knowledge matters enough to be worth giving properly. Cora grew. She grew into a girl who could balance a ledger and ride a horse and argue the meaning of a poem and fix a fence post, and she did all of these things with an equal and unapologetic capability that made the neighboring farm wives look at Mae and nod with the knowing look of women who understand exactly what kind of mother produces exactly that kind of daughter. On an afternoon 5 years after Mae had climbed down from a feed merchant's wagon with a battered trunk and a steady gaze, she sat on the farmhouse porch, while the last of the afternoon light turned the Flint Hills to copper and rose. The wheat in the east field stood high and even, a good crop, an honest one. Caleb was riding the fence line of the south pasture, a small figure against the enormous sky. Cora was at the creek with the neighboring children, her voice carrying on the wind in bursts of laughter. On the small table beside Mae's chair sat the farm ledger, its columns neat, its pages full of the precise and truthful language of numbers well kept. She set her hand on the cover for a moment. She thought about the desk she had sat at on her first night, the chaos of those scattered receipts, the cold dread of that bank letter. She thought about the long ride in from the county road, all her worldly goods in a single trunk, every bridge burned behind her. She had come here asking for work. She had come here with nothing to offer but her mind and her integrity, and the willingness to put them both fully in service of something worth saving. And she had saved it. And it had, in return, given her everything. Caleb rode in at dusk, as he always had. He dismounted at the gate and came up the porch steps, and sat beside her in his chair, and looked out at the hills going dark in the east. After a while, he said, "Good day." "Very good," Mae said. He was quiet. The crickets started up in the grass. A light appeared in Cora's window where she had gone up to read. "Do you remember what Pruitt said when he drove away that morning?" Caleb asked. Mae smiled. "He said he'd be in touch." Caleb laughed, low and easy. "He wasn't." "No," Mae said. "He wasn't." Caleb reached over and took her hand on the arm of her chair, the way he always did at this hour, a habit so deep now it had become part of the evening itself. "He came here thinking we were finished," Caleb said quietly. "Thinking he could walk onto this land and name his price, and there was nothing to be done." "He didn't know about the ledger," Mae said. "He didn't know about you," Caleb said. She looked at him. He was watching the hills, his profile steady and familiar against the violet sky, the man who had set a third place at his table on her very first evening without being asked, who had offered her a chair at the table when she had come expecting scraps. She laced her fingers through his and held on. That is the quiet miracle of it, friends. It is not always the loudest story that changes a life. Sometimes it is a woman who sits down at a desk in the dead of night with a pen and the truth, and refuses to let the numbers lie. Sometimes the most powerful thing in the world is a person who sees the shape of the wrong clearly and has the patience and the courage to set it right without raising her voice. Mae Whitfield came to the Alderman farm with nothing but her mind and her integrity. She left with everything worth having. And so it goes, when people choose to meet each other at the level of their full worth. Thank you for spending this time with me today, friends. It is always a privilege to know these stories find you wherever you are. Drop your state or your country in the comments below. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Until next time, keep faith with the good and steady things. There are days when we arrive somewhere new, carrying almost nothing, just our wits, our honesty, and the quiet determination not to let the wrong things win. Mae didn't fight with fury or noise. She sat down, read the truth in the numbers, and held her ground without trembling. That's something any of us can do. Show up fully, work carefully, and trust that integrity, given enough time, builds something no one can take away. A small note for you, friend. This story was created and fictionalized by AI, shared here to bring you a moment of warmth and entertainment, and to leave behind one small, true thing worth carrying with you.